So I'd like to welcome everybody here to the Shropshire Morning Star Reading and Supporters Group, and thank you very much for attending. This is our first meeting of this year, 2015, and we couldn't be happier with the subject title we've received, which is the as yet relatively unknown story of ANC recruits who went over to South Africa, and Ken, who was one of those recruits, and was also the editor of the book where his account and the accounts of many other volunteers are recorded, and you'll hear more about that in just a second. I was trying to recall last night when I became aware of the issue of apartheid, and it was I did a Google search last night to tie it down, and it was 1984, and it was when the record Free Nelson Mandela was released, and I heard that record, and I remember being at a social occasion in Birmingham at the time, and I remember saying, "Who's Nelson Mandela?" And that was my first exposure to the issue, to the subject of apartheid in South Africa, to the racism and the oppression there, and the ANC, and currently the Communist Party, and then the worldwide forces. And obviously, as soon as I became aware of it as an issue, it hit me viscerally like it hits most people, the complete injustice and unfairness of the system, and what can we do to help? And of course, I did what many people here did, and I'm confident many people in the room did, and that was join the anti-apartheid movement and undertook many boycott and sanction supporting campaigns and measures. Little did I know, or indeed I suspect little did anybody else know, that there was this secret element to that campaign going on underneath it, and it's been such a revelation. You cannot believe how jealous I am that I wasn't around and available to ask. Because my self-identity is so tied up with the fact that I definitely would have gone, I would love to have gone, but I wasn't around, I wasn't asked, and probably no one would have asked me, knowing me at the time. So they picked very good people, as the fact that it was kept secret for over 40 years has demonstrated. And so, without any further ado, I'm very proud to welcome Ken. Ken, you told the story in the book in 2012 for the first time. Thank you very much, and welcome to this meeting.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be speaking on this platform of the Morning Star, because I have a very close relationship with the Morning Star and with its predecessor, the Daily Worker. My father actually was the last individual owner of the Daily Worker, and he sold it to the People's Press Printing Society in February 1946 for a shilling. They always said he never actually got the shilling. My mother was the first cartoonist on the Daily Worker from the first 2 years of its existence. She did a daily children's cartoon called Mickey Mongrel, Our Class Conscious Cur, which was about a little dog who did all sorts of political and working class activities. And then from 1956 to 1970, while I was growing up, she was children's editor of the Daily Worker and its successor, the Morning Star. And I also, I'm very, very close to the Morning Star myself. It means a great deal to me. And it's that sort of background, that sort of education is partly why I ended up doing this activity that I did, why I was selected for it. I think it's important to give a little historical context. Racism is not a natural human trait. It's something people invented for a reason, and I think it was originally invented in order to justify and to facilitate the enslavement of African people. If you can convince yourself that the things you're doing or allowed to be doing to certain people can't happen to you, then it's all right, it's not so bad. You can treat them as somebody else that these things happen to, and it couldn't happen to me. It makes it easier to have this racism, and that's, I think, why it was invented by certain European countries. The first British slave trader was Captain John Hawkins, who was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I for his slave trading activities. His coat of arms had a picture of an African, black African, with ropes around binding his arms, and he was bound, very, very firmly bound. Sir Francis Drake was a slave trader. I learned about him at school, but it's only about 2 years ago that I discovered that he was a slave trader. But it's deeply in our history. The British Empire, in my view, it had to modify its racism to suit the needs of the empire. And in my view, British Empire could not have functioned for a single day without official state-sponsored race discrimination and racist ideology. And nowadays we have another version of it, Islamophobia, which is essentially the same thing. The people, the powers that be, invent a version of racism that suits their particular needs at a particular time. So it's no surprise then that when South Africa was established by Act of the British Parliament, it was established as a racist setup. The Westminster Parliament passed the South Africa Act 1909, which set up the new dominion within the British Empire called the Union of South Africa, which united 4 colonies, that's why the word union, and that it would have a parliament elected on a racist basis and for white people only. Well, actually white men only, of course, because it was as much sexist as it was racist for similar reasons. So white men only in this parliament. And if it hadn't been set up in that way, it's inconceivable that the racist laws that were passed later on by the successor parliament would have passed those laws. When the Afrikaner Nationalist Party came to power in 1948, they set about setting up this new system, which they called Apartheid in the Afrikaner language, which means separateness. We sort of pronounce it apartheid over here, but that was a mistake when the word reached this country. Apartheid is what it's called in South Africa, and I switched between the two. So they started setting up the apartheid laws, and this was sort of setting up the whole country on a racist basis. And as I say, you couldn't have had them passing those laws if they'd been accountable to a black electorate. It's inconceivable. So Britain, was deeply implicated in this thing. And it was so bad. In the summer of 1960, there was the infamous Sharpeville massacre, which brought the horrors of the apartheid system to the attention of the world. This was a peaceful protest against the pass laws, requiring people to carry passes indicating whether they were allowed to do certain things, be in certain places at certain times. Very oppressive. And they peacefully protested against it, and they were shot, a large number of them. But it was that and a number of other massacres and other atrocities around that time, and the complete refusal of the regime to talk to organisations representing Africans, representing the majority of the country, that the leadership of the liberation movement decided that they had no alternative but to start on a form, initially a very limited form, of armed struggle. Nelson Mandela at that time, according to the South African Communist Party now, Nelson Mandela was a member of the party and a member of their leadership at that time when that decision was taken. They set up a headquarters in a farm called Lilies Leaf Farm at Rivonia, just outside Johannesburg, and that farmhouse is now a museum to the history of the armed struggle. And they've recently, just on the 6th of March this year, they set up a special section of this museum devoted to the story of the London recruits. It's very nice. I've got some pictures on our website of this, and they're going to develop it in the future, and this book is very much part of that. I joined the Young Communist League just in advance of my 14th birthday in 1959, so this was just before the Sharpeville massacre. In 1967, I was attending the London District Congress of the Young Communist League, and I was approached by the District Secretary, a man named George Bridges, who cautiously asked me if I was willing to do something illegal. And because I'd known him about 7 years, and because he was an important figure in my sort of world, I cautiously said yes, and it became apparent that he wanted me to go to South Africa and pay a visit there and do something or other to help the liberation movement there. And so when he explained that, I said, well, I'm at the City University taking my final exams in January, and after I've done those, I'll be free and available to come. And so I did that, and after January, he took me and introduced me to a man named Ronnie Casriels, a South African, and he sent me off after meeting quite a number of times. I had a lot of conversations with him about what was to be done. He sent me off to Johannesburg. I had a false bottom suitcase which contained 1,200 letters which were addressed to the Indian people there. I was only dimly aware that there were any Indian people in South Africa. I hadn't seen the film Gandhi at that time, it hadn't been made, of course. So I went to Johannesburg. I was able to get through into South Africa without the slightest difficulty, because the point is they hit upon this idea of recruiting white non-South African people. The officials and the police who were looking out for ANC members returning into the country, they weren't looking for people like me, you know, no way. And somebody coming in there. And I'll just go back a little bit. When after the Rivonia trial, after they started the preparing for the armed struggle, they were betrayed by a spy and they were arrested, and so we had the Rivonia trial of many of the leaders that resulted in the jailing of Nelson Mandela for life. They were going to hang him, but there was a terrific worldwide campaign to prevent that, and so he wasn't hanged. But he and other leaders that were jailed for life, and then the remainder of the ANC membership, almost all of them, apart from Winnie Mandela and one or two others, had to go into exile, because if they stayed there, they were arrested and they were tortured until they gave the name of somebody else, and so on. It was just impossible. So they had to leave. Their morale was very, very low. They were based elsewhere in Africa, and they were wondering how on earth they were going to carry on their struggle inside the country when they were not in it and couldn't return to it. So they had this four-man leadership group based in London. Joe Slovo, these were all members of the South African Communist Party as well as the ANC, because the two were very closely intertwined at that time. Joe Slovo, Dr. Yusuf Dadoo, who was the acknowledged leader of the Indian community, who later became chair of the South African Communist Party, Jack Hodgson, another white Communist Party and ANC member, and a much younger man, Ronnie Casrills. And they hit upon this brilliant idea of recruiting white, non-South African people who could not safely, but who could go into South Africa without arousing suspicion. And that was a brilliant move, because it turned the racism of the regime into a weapon against it. Very, very clever idea. And it was done in two ways. The recruitment for this was done in two ways, and Ronnie Casrills was put in charge of recruiting people. One thing he did, they approached the leadership of the British Communist Party and said, well, we want you to provide us with these kind of people. We want white people, we want completely committed people, and we want people who have no family responsibilities and dependents, because if they get arrested and jailed, then their dependents will become, at least morally, our responsibility. So they want none of that. So that meant young people. So they agreed. They had a meeting with John Gollan, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and Jack Wallace, the International Secretary, and they made an agreement that they would provide them with these kind of people, and that the London District Secretary of the Young Communist League would be the recruiter. So that was how I got recruited. I was the second person to be recruited in that way. The first one was Daniel Ahern, who made many more trips to South Africa than I did, actually. The other way they did it was that Ronnie Casrills was enrolled as a student at the London School of Economics, where there was a lot of political activity going on at that time on a related issue about racism and about Rhodesia, actually. And Tariq Ali was one of the people there at the time, you know, he's still going around. And he enrolled there, and he joined the Socialist Student Society, and he recruited people there. Some of them were Trotskyists, some of them were like members of the International Socialists, which was just getting started at that time, which was the predecessor of the Socialist Workers' Party. Some of them are still in the Socialist Workers' Party, the people recruited that way. Some of them were just general left-wing people. There was one American, Danny Schechter, who just died very recently, who went on to become a journalist and filmmaker, who devoted many, many years of his life to making films about South Africa, documentary films. Made, I think, half a dozen films with Nelson Mandela. And other people. There was some Irish people, and so on. So the people recruited in these various ways were not all British people. Most of them were sort of British from the London area, but many were others. There was Greeks, Greek Australian, Irish, a French woman, and so on. So there I went to Johannesburg. I posted these. I had to book into a hotel, buy 1,200 stamps, stick them on the letters, and then go around posting them in different places around the city, and then send a cable back to someone in London who I didn't know at all, but just had a name to send to, and that was a signal to Ronnie that I'd done the job and I was about to get the plane home. So I flew home. And I found I was able to, because I was so convinced what I was doing was right and was important and was good, I found I was able to lie more effectively than I ever imagined. To everybody as to why I was away for a few days and so on. I didn't tell anybody at all. A couple of years later, Ronnie approached me again and said he had another job for me and he wanted me to recruit somebody to go with me. So I recruited my friend Pete Smith, who was also a member of that Islington branch of the YCL, and we went to Durban in August of 1970. And our task there was more complicated. We stayed there, I think, about a week, and we had to construct some bucket-type leaflet bombs. And this was a new invention. It was invented in London, the bucket-type leaflet bomb. Well, it started, I think, in Bristol. It was tested in. There's a scientist who died a couple of years ago, living in Bristol, an ANC member, who devised this thing in conjunction with the other members of the group. It was tested in Bristol and in the Mendip Hills there, and it was tested in Hampstead Heath and Richmond Park in London. And it's a bucket, plastic bucket, concealed inside a carrier bag. It's got a sort of small firework type explosive at the bottom. It's full of leaflets, and there's a battery, and it goes to a timing device on the outside, and it's got some warning signs, little things on the top, little rubber spiders and snakes and things on to frighten people away so they didn't dig into it. And you take it to where you decide you've got to leave it, set the timer so you've got time to get away, leave it there, and then after a few minutes, there's a bang, and leaflets fly high up into the air and fly all around, and they don't know who's done it, basically. That was one thing we did. The other thing, at the same time, we set up a street broadcast. This was using a cassette player, which was the latest technology at the time. I'd never seen one before. A cassette player feeding into an amplifier. In our case, we had it fitted up on the front of a kind of butcher's delivery bike, or the basket at the front, and chained that to a tree or a lamppost, I can't remember which it was. And it was time to come out with its message at the same time as these leaflet bombs went off. And I'll never forget the start of it, because Ronnie played it to us before we set off. There's a voice booming out. He said, "This is the African National Congress. This is the African National Congress. This is the voice of freedom." And then you heard the ANC Exile Choir in London singing "Causi Sigaleli Africa," the ANC anthem, "God Bless Africa," and so on. Of course, it had an electrifying effect on the crowd. We were told to do it at a particular time on a particular day. It was the end of the working day, when all the black people who worked in this whites-only city, quite whites-only, because of course you couldn't function without black people working in it, but at the end of the working day they had to leave unless they were house-served, go back to the black townships, and they all gathered at one place where there's this blacks-only railway station, this blacks-only bus station, and so these things went off at that time. And it occurred to me at the time that maybe we were part of some bigger operation, possibly, and when we got the newspapers the next day, there it was, we could see that it happened at other cities at the same time. When we got back, we were told that in fact it happened in 5 cities simultaneously. So it sent a very clear message to the people and to the authorities that the ANC is not defeated. Yeah. It's still capable of mounting quite a sophisticated operation like that, and it's got printing facilities and so on, and it's in 5 cities at the same time. So quite a sophisticated and imaginative operation. Well, I didn't do any more after that. Pete Smith went on to work for the ANC on and off for the next 20 years, up to 1990. He went for training in the Soviet Union and in Cuba, and he did a whole lot of things. He kept a safe house in Botswana, close to the border for a while, and all sorts of other things. He helped Ronnie Casuals to cross the border from Botswana into South Africa. I don't know the whole story of what he did. He'd written one chapter in this book, but he's supposed to be writing a book of his life now. I don't know if he will do it. I hope he does. He did a lot of things. Lots of other people did. In about 1993, Ronnie Casuals published a book called "Armed and Dangerous: My Undercover Struggle Against Apartheid," because there'd been a poster up, a wanted notice for him that said "Armed and Dangerous," which indeed he was, and to that regime. And so a very interesting book, which I'd recommend everyone to read. Actually, it's in its 4th edition now, and it's that period is interesting because not only about South Africa, it's about the relationship between what was going on in South Africa and the Cold War, the worldwide situation, and the Cubans and their involvement, and so on. South Africa was a kind of it was assumed generally on all sides that if the ANC came to power, South Africa would become an ally of the Soviet Union in the Cold War and not the United States. What has happened, of course, the Cold War started to break up, the Soviet Union started to break up in the from the late 80s onwards, and or yes, the late 80s onwards, and so that changed the whole situation and the relationship between the white racist regime and its sort of sponsors in the United States and Britain. So we got a new situation developing. Now, we now know, what happened after that, after reading that chapter and thinking about it, well, when I reached the age of 60 in 2005, because I was born in 1945, I asked myself, what have I got to do before I die? When I feel death approaching, what would I most regret not having done? And I recommend anyone to ask that question, ask themselves that question any time, not just when they reach a particular age. This is quite a useful question. And as soon as I asked it, I knew the answer. I've got to write the story of what I'd done, which I kept a secret all those years. Very, very few people know. I mentioned it to very, very close family members, but I didn't talk much about it. And so I sat down and I wrote the thing. I'd already done a bit of writing for publication by that time. So I wrote the story of what I'd done, and all the memories came flooding back that I hadn't thought about for years. And then when I'd finished it, I thought, well, no, I won't just publish that. I'll try and contact the other people who did these sort of things. So I knew there were a few of them. I knew a bit about them, but not very much. And asked them to write their stories and then put them all in one book. And I didn't know how big it would be or what it would be, but I just thought it was bound to be an interesting book. So Ronnie was coming to London in June of 2005 in his capacity as intelligence minister in the government, and he asked the British High Commissioner in South Africa House, High Commissioner is the Commonwealth equivalent of an ambassador, to lay on a reception for us. He called it a reunion, because for him it was a reunion, but for us it was a reception because we didn't know each other, or at least some of us did, but didn't know that the others were involved. So we had this most amazing meeting, which wasn't reported anywhere, in South Africa House, where we all looked at, you were in this, sort of thing. And some of us had been like political enemies at the time, Trotskyists versus communists, etc., and various things. But here we were, doing the same things at the same time, all those years ago. And that was a very, very moving occasion for all of us. And a bit of a lesson as well about the need for the left, to put aside its differences at times and try and unite on what we agree on. And it was at that meeting that I launched the idea of this book, and said to them, will you write your story, and I'll put it, and there'll be a chapter in the book, and I'll just edit the thing. I won't impose my views on it. Everyone could give their own views of how they feel about the thing, because I'd already written mine and put my opinion about it, so I couldn't deny that to anybody else, even if they disagreed. So we've got different views in there of the kind of meaning of it all. But and that's where it started. It took me a long time. It wasn't until 2012 the book was published. Some people wrote their story very, very quickly. Some people took months and years even to be persuaded to actually start it. They kept it locked up in their head all that time, and they put it behind them as something that happened a long time ago in a different world, when the world was different, before the end of the Cold War. And it took a long time to come around to writing. But brilliant when they did. And it was kind of a cathartic moment for all of them, I think, to put it all down and make sense of it. And then there was a wonderful moment for all when they saw the book when it came out. So quite amazed, of course. I was amazed every time I received another story from somebody. I'd look at it, wow, that's fantastic. Now we now know, because of the book and all the information we put together, and with what Ronnie has told us and so on, that the London recruits did some kind of publicity work and agitational work inside South Africa, at least once a year, every year, from 1967 to 1973, which is quite something. We took about 1 million leaflets into South Africa. Often we had operations in 5 cities simultaneously, but in several different places in the same city as well, in addition to that. So lots of people involved. I think now, I estimate that there are probably about 50 London recruits in all, probably. But don't know, there's still quite a lot we haven't found yet, and some of them died. So and we've now got a website, and already we've got a story about 2 more people who went in 1973, and we didn't know, and they only came forward and were discovered after the book was published. There were 2 women who were both London recruits, Joy Lehman and Mary Chamberlain. Mary Chamberlain wrote her chapter for the book very late on, and quite short, because she only came forward, we only discovered her very late, just shortly before the book was ready to go to the publisher. But after the book was published, Joy Lehman appeared, these two women had been working as lecturers at London Printing School, London School of Printing, for 10 years and sharing the same office, and they were quite good friends. They each didn't know that the others had done this, had been to South Africa. What Joy did, it turned out, was something different again. She went with a Labour councillor named John O'Malley. They had to buy a Roneo duplicator when they got to South Africa, and then print off letters in an African language which they couldn't speak and post them to all sorts of people. So it was quite a different kind of thing than what the rest of us did. So there's a huge variety of things. There's another big activity that had already been made known, at least in South Africa, because a documentary film was made about it. Joe Slovo had the idea of setting up a fake safari tour company, not to shoot animals, but to study wildlife and so on. A safari company at its headquarters in Greenwich High Road, and it was called Africa Hinterland. And they would give people a perfectly genuine holiday, travelling down through Africa, but they didn't know they were sitting on all these weapons, because this was a Bedford truck that was designed and modified to carry weapons, specific kinds of weapons. The drivers and tour guides on it were either British people or Dutch people, a combination of two, and they smuggled over a number of years 40 tons of weapons into South Africa. Of course, everybody thought the whole thing was going to end in a bloodbath. Anybody who asked at the time would say that. And there was a lot of violence towards them, nothing like what people expected. But there was a lot. So they had those weapons anyway. I don't know to what extent they were used or not. But they without ever getting caught, they smuggled vast quantity of weapons in. And it was a very, very nerve-wracking thing. And there's a film being made about it, a documentary film made by an Australian company. It's called Secret Safari. You can get it on the website, now on our website. So a whole variety of things that they did. Some of them went for training in Cuba and the Soviet Union. Some of them, three of the London recruits were arrested in early 1972. Sean Hosey, also a member of Islington branch, although was originally Dubliner, he was arrested on his second mission. He was given at very short notice a job to do, to carry a package with some money and some false documents to a black comrade in Durban, and when he got there it had all been set up. The black comrade had been tortured and forced to send a letter to London saying, send me these things please, and so on, and he put a signal into the letter, a pre-arranged signal to indicate that he was acting under duress, but the police knew about it and they cut out the signal. So there you are. So Sean Hosey walked into a trap. He was 13 months awaiting trial, and then he was 5 years in prison, a good deal of it in solitary confinement. So that was Sean. He tells some of his story in the book, but since then he's also spoken on the radio and TV, and every time he speaks he brings out a new bit of information about what happened to him, because he found it so difficult. When I first approached him, he flatly refused to write the story. It was just such a horrible experience he didn't want to bring it back. But then we traced the person who'd gone with him on his first trip and who'd recruited him, and he managed to persuade Sean to change his mind. Good evening. Hello. And so that was Sean Hosey, wonderful speaker as well. Alex Mumbaris and his wife, Marie-José Mumbaris, they were arrested the same year, spring of 1972, for they were attempting to smuggle some black ANC fighters. And Marie-José was pregnant, and after a very bad treatment in prison, she was released because she was French, and there was a big campaign building up in France to get her released. And I think she was probably more an embarrassment to them, and so on. They released her, but her husband, Alex, he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. He escaped after 7.5 years, along with two white South African comrades, Tim Jenkin and Steve Lee. Tim Jenkin was something of a locksmith, and they worked in the prison workshop where they were supposed to be doing a bit of furniture repair as a form of therapy or something to keep them occupied, and they made wooden keys, replica wooden keys. When you're in prison like that, there's one thing you've got, and that's time, and they used time to make these keys and let themselves out. Let themselves out at the appropriate time, just after the sort of place was closed up for the night. And they've written a book about it, and there's a, it's called, I think it's called Escape from Pretoria, and it's also on the web. And there's a film that's been made about it as well, documentary film. It's one of the great prison stories of all time, in my opinion. Wonderful story. And anyway, so there we are. I think I've told most of the story of the London recruits. There's lots of little stories in there. As I say, it's over 30 chapters there, each one written by a different person, and Ronnie Carriage writes an introduction to kind of set the thing in context. We're now preparing to make, or beginning to make a film. There's a company called Barefoot Rascals based in Cardiff who are making, we've signed a contract with them and with a publisher to make a film of the subject under the title London Recruits, and they in fact they've gained some more information than what I had when I did the book. They found some people in South Africa who received one of our letters in the post, or picked up one of the leaflets and the leaflet bombs and so on, and trying to find more people. They've also interviewed some of the people who were leading ANC members at the time, and how they, I met them when I went to South Africa to launch the book in 2012, but they're very emotional about this, because it came at such a difficult time for them. They just had no idea how they were going to turn the thing around when they were in exile, and this thing came sort of out of the blue rather, and changed the situation. So although the liberation struggle was achieved by the South African people, not by us of course, but we did play a particularly significant role just at one particular time. But there's other recruits who did other things at different times, and there's a huge variety. One story I didn't mention, the story of the Aventura. A number of Liverpool seamen were recruited to take a yacht called the Aventura from Somalia with MK ANC fighters on it, and try to land them off the coast of South Africa. And that was an abortive mission, unfortunately. But as a result of this book, Liverpool City Council earlier this year unveiled a plaque in the city, giving the names of some of the seamen and some of the Liverpool people involved, but in honour of this thing that they did, this act of solidarity. So there's still a lot of things happening. I think what I'd like to do now is go over to questions and discussion about this, because there's probably a lot of questions you want to ask. I know I'd perhaps finish just by saying that the thing that keeps me fired up to keep on talking about this and promoting this book, which I make no money out of, by the way, and all the royalties go to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, is that the issues it's about, the ideas it's about, are just very, very relevant to today. International solidarity, anti-racism, internationalism, they're more relevant in the 21st century than they were then even. So there's a message we want to pass on to the younger generation from the 60s, what we did.
Thanks a lot there, Ken. That was a hell of a run through, and at some point you're going to have to tell the story of the firework in your hotel.
Oh yes, I do that if you like.
There's
a mistake I made. You couldn't mention it.
Oh, I can never let a meeting go without mentioning
I'm the only one that whether to put it in there, because I made an awfully, terribly embarrassing mistake which haunted me all my life and made me feel bad about what I'd done instead of good about what I'd done. I now feel good about what I did, and this mistake is just a detail, you know.
But I keep reminding him of it.
I'm in the hotel in Durban the night before the action's due to take place, with Pete Smith there, and we're starting to set up our leaflet bombs, four or five, I'm not sure how many. And so we'd undone the false bottoms of our suitcases to get the leaflets out, with a tin opener, the old-fashioned type of tin opener, to get it out, which is fiberglass. And we'd bought certain things they had to buy, the buckets and things like that we bought locally, and one of the leaflets, some of the buckets were all set up and ready to go with the leaflets in. We just had to put them in the boot of the car in the morning and take them out. And I made this mistake, and I accidentally set one of them off in the hotel room, sometime in the early hours of the morning. Went off with a terrific bang, spread leaflets all over the room, and I just thought, mine was racing actually. I just thought, what can I do? There's certain things I can't do. I can't pretend it didn't happen. I can't get out of the room and run. Various thoughts are possible. And anyway, I don't know what Pete was thinking at this time. But anyway, eventually someone came knocking at the door, and I knew it was an Indian because the restaurant was run by Indians. A lot of Indians in the Durban area, and this Indian guy was knocking on the door. Know what's going on inside? What was that? And I didn't open the door because he only had to put one eye in the door and he'd have seen these leaflets everywhere. So I said, the point is, we were taking advantage again of the race thing, you see. We were two young white guys. If we'd have beaten him up, we'd have probably got away with it, because that's the way it was. That's the way it was. The injustice of the system was so obvious, you couldn't miss it. There it was. We weren't thinking of beating him up, but I said to him, look, somebody threw a firework in through the window. There'd been some fireworks going on in the city earlier on, because it was some kind of festival. I'm not sure, I thought at the time it was Ramadan, the Muslim festival. Somebody has since said to me it must have been the Hindu festival of Diwali, but I don't know. Anyway, so I said, someone threw a firework in the window. I said, I said nothing's harm, nothing damaged, everything's fine, no problem. It's just, it's happened and nothing to worry about. And he just went on his way. If he'd been a white hotel manager, he'd probably wanted to come in and see, but no, he didn't. So we cleared it all up. There was a little black mark on the ceiling, which we didn't get noticed. In the morning, when we woke up, there were still some leaflets we hadn't managed to find the previous night, still around. So we just carried on with one less leaflet bomb. We put the leaflets in the other buckets and carried on. So I'm glad you mentioned that. But it did haunt me, for a very long time. But now I just, and Pete keeps saying, oh, you did fine, Ken, you did fine, it wasn't your fault. But it was, but anyway. Yeah.
And as you say, I mean, the Indian hotel owner, you're thinking he didn't barge in, because if he barged in to two white people, he could never win that argument.
There's a similar story. It's in the book there. Two other London recruits the following year were also in Durban, 1971. And while they were setting up their leagues, they did it after breakfast, you see. They were working class boys, they weren't used to hotels and things. And they went to breakfast, they come back, they then started opening up all their stuff and preparing their leaflet bombs for the same day, not the following day, for the same day. And I think it was the same day, I'm sure. And in walks a hotel staff, as the chamber lady, they call her, a young woman about their age, ready to do the room. She got a key, of course. They'd lock the door, they didn't think, they got the key, and she walks. There's seated stuff everywhere. Well, to cut a long story short, they explained to her what they were doing, and she didn't betray them at all. A considerable risk to herself, of course. We tried to find her since, but we can't find her. But she was a brave person who decided that she was going to keep quiet about this. So that's another story that we have to tell. There we are. Okay.
No, that's magnificent. No, it truly is. There's and you get the real detail in the book, in the stories. And I would urge everyone who's interested in this subject, one, get the book, read the book, and then there's more updated versions, because some of the speakers, as Ken just said, have spoken more to the media since 2012 and whatever, and then you remember a little bit more detail, and you've spoken about it 2 or 3 times, and suddenly it comes together. Some people have done radio and television adverts, which are all new information, none of which are in the book. They're just more detailed than in the book, and it's more, fresh in people's minds, and it's all available on the website London Recruits. So I'm happy for anyone to ask any questions. Anybody under the age of 45 gets priority, because they don't know apartheid.
That means I go first.
That's what we're all thinking about, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, is your book selling well in South Africa now?
Well, I believe it sold about 400 copies. They haven't got... The books are more expensive in South Africa. A lot of people just can't afford books at all. And so it sold 400, yes. And I think it sold, in total, including the 400, I think it's sold about 1,600 in total so far.
And the media are using it, hopefully.
Well, in places, yes. I mean, it's led to a number of things. It's in a few public libraries, It's led to this special London Recruits section of the museum in Lisley Farm. It's led to Liverpool City Council putting up a plaque. It's led to a number of things. But there's still lots of people who haven't heard about it. But we have got a film company, as I said, who are making a documentary film about it, which will go further than the book, and say more than the book was able to say, do a lot more background research and so on. They're hoping to find somebody within the regime who's going to report what they thought of it when it happened, you know, what they thought of what we did. I
Yes, and I was going to ask you about that, Ken. I thought you'd mentioned, I thought at one point they'd discovered one of the Secret Service agents who was...
I thought perhaps they had,
receiving
they're certainly trying to find somebody. I'm not sure whether they found anybody.
Right, no, fair enough. Has anyone got any questions?
Yeah, I was interested to know how prepared you were for getting arrested.
I'm sorry?
How prepared you were for getting arrested and what the plan was. Presumably there was a plan if that were ever to happen.
Well, my cover story, if anybody asked me, was, well, I've just graduated as an electrical engineer, and my father's given me a 3 months economy return ticket to come and have a look at South Africa, see if I want to settle here and make my career here, you see. Well, they were rolling out the red carpet for people like that, you see, at that time, if you were white, of course. So that was to be my story, if anybody asked me why I was there. I don't think I was as afraid as I should have been. I thought the thing was such a good scheme, good wheeze, you know, that very unlikely I would get caught. In a sense it was. The people who got caught were caught for other reasons, you know, not because they saw you coming at the airport or anything like that. So at the airport, the point of entry, some people went by sea, you know. You know, the amazing story. There was a couple, Mary Chamberlain and her husband, Carey Harrison. She's rewritten her story since. She's a wonderful writer. And they went in on the Union Castle line by sea from Southampton. They smuggled in sort of tea chest type of, tea chests, you know, that they use for transport. You can take a lot more into the country by sea than you can by air. And they smuggled 7,000 packages with little booklets inside for posting. At one point, a policeman helped to carry some of their packages. He said, she was doing it, and the policeman said, picked it up and said, oh, it's heavy. He said, what is it you women carry in your bags? So, you know, there was the white being white. I thought it was so well thought out. I was ever so pleased as well, because Ronnie said, look, we've got to assume that the boss, the Bureau of State Security, is cooperating with the British Secret Services and the CIA. We believe they will share information. And at the end of it, you know, I got back and I was part of an activity that defeated all these organisations. I felt immensely proud, of course, and it was all because of this trick. So I didn't actually feel I was in great danger. Perhaps I should have done, but when you're young, you feel, you know. I wasn't going to stop doing it anyway, but I did think, because of this trick, you know, there wasn't any reason why they would suspect me.
Actually, listening to a couple of the other speakers, I'm not sure there was a plan. Well, the plan was, you're on your own, there's nothing we can do, which is why one of the comrades just served 5 years. What can you do? There's, so, in that sense, I think everyone went out there with the understanding that, you know, good luck and all the rest of it, but if you get caught, we've got no power to help you. Yeah. So it's so the plan was you're on your own. But as long as people understood that in advance, then that's a risk. And as you say, you're young and immortal. You think nothing can touch you at 20, don't you? So
well, all the people that were asked by the 2 London District Secretaries of the Young Communist League, George Bridges and his successor, Bob Allen, all of them said yes. None of them said no, I won't do it. Which is something, it tells you something about what I said at the time. It tells you something about young people in Britain at that time who were different to today. I'm not saying young people today wouldn't do that, but I'm saying there was an atmosphere of optimism, the feeling we can change the world and so on. You know.
So, have you been back in recent years, and if so, what's your impression now in South Africa?
I've only been once. That was in 2012 to launch the book there. And wonderful experience, very, very moving experience, especially the actual journey there, arriving and so on. And when I arrived, Ronnie Casarals, I was on my own, Ronnie Casarals and his wife Amina were there to greet me, and we spent about an hour and a half sitting in the airport, recovering from an all-night flight in which I was supposed to sleep, but I hadn't slept a wink actually. Just looking around and saying, well, what do you notice that's different? You know, and it was so much. Because my first arrival at the it was now called O.R. Tambo Airport, and previously it was called Jan Smuts Airport. That's one difference, you know. And my first view of it in 1968 was how oppressive it was, how the racism, the injustice of the society, it was just totally obvious. It wasn't hidden in any way. All the white people had the important superior jobs, and all the black people were running around doing what they were told and so on. And it was totally different. You saw it in 2012, you saw black people in positions of authority, you saw a much more relaxed atmosphere, you saw white people behaving differently than the way they would have behaved in 1968, because they didn't have to keep up a front, you know, to say that we are master race, we are the masters of the universe. They were more relaxed. And you saw mixed race families, you saw black police officers, all these kind of things. It was very different and wonderful thing to see. Wonderful thing to see, yes.
I went out to South Africa in 1998 on a union tour, and that's the first and only time I've been. And I went out there as, my background is as a nurse, and so I went to speak to a group of nurses in a hospital training, and they had a meeting, and they clearly had an agenda out on there at the minute on this student nurse meeting. And I looked at their agenda items, and every single item on their agenda was identical to an exact agenda as a nursing meeting we'd have in Britain. All the same issues, virtually in the same order. There's the exact same problems. And I walked in, and I've never experienced anything like this before or since. And I've, in a sense, a bit like Ken's got a regret from South Africa, my regret was not raising this right up in front when I was confronted with it. But I walked into the room, and it was a meeting of 12 people, 12 student nurses, 6 black student nurses sitting on that side of the table, and 6 white student nurses sitting on this, and a black chair. And I just looked at that, and I thought, that's inconceivable. I'd walk into any environment in Britain in the nursing context, and you'd see that. If you walked in and saw that, that would scream a concern to you. And I've never had in 20 years seen that, and I've been in many classrooms. So, but this was dramatic, and I think I mentioned it to you or to someone when I come back, or some later years. And of course, it was 6 white nurses, 6 black nurses. But before 1994, there'd have been 6 white nurses, and there wouldn't have been any black nurses. And I went around the hospital and saw the separate blood banks for the white patients, from white blood for the white patients, and black blood for the black patients. And,
could you tell the difference between the blood?
And it was the most remarkable thing. And of course, how had to be white nurses to look after the white patients and black nurses to look after black patients. But very occasionally they required a very skilled nurse to do a very important job, and that was when they went to the black senior nurse and got them in to do on the specialised white ITU white unit, when none of the other white nurses could do it because they didn't have the level of training. But the white never went to the black. This was historical. I was telling you. I went in '98 and they was telling me what it was like. There wasn't separate blood banks at the time I went there, but obviously they got all this markings. So who here, is everyone here, did at some point, I make a presumption that if you're over the age of 50 you had the opportunity of participating in anti-apartheid. Most people do that in some form or another. Demonstrations, boycotts, petitions.
Sit down.
Presumably no one had any clue.
No.
At all. That's
But what surprises me, and well, maybe it did happen and nothing happened from it, is that it wasn't infiltrated by the state. Because we know that Greenpeace has, we know that the airport runway stuff has, we know all over the world that all of these struggles, and struggles I've been involved with, there have been people within who you would know, share a drink with,
Oh, yeah.
have a chat with, but they're actually working on the other side, and you don't know that. And it's quite extraordinary that this never got.
Well,
Or did it?
No, it wasn't really possible, you see. We didn't know each other, you see. We weren't a group that met together and knew each other. You only knew other people on a need-to-know basis. You see, I knew about Pete Smith because I'd recruited him. I knew George Smith was the recruiter because he'd recruited me, but I didn't know who else he'd recruited. By chance or by something that happened, I got to know about Bob Newland because he'd been recruited by Pete Smith, and there was something that happened that they needed to consult me about something, so they told me. So that's how I knew about them. And then, of course, I forget now exactly, I did come to know about Sean Hosey before he got arrested. I can't remember why it was. Because they'd seen him on the plane, that's right. Bob and Pete had seen Sean on the plane coming back on his first mission, that's right. And they mentioned it to me because they were a bit concerned about something. But apart from that, we didn't know about the others. So there wasn't, I remember thinking to myself at the time, how could I be betrayed? And the only person who could possibly betray me was Ronnie Casriels. And I just thought, well, I've met the man, I'm very, very impressed with him. I just cannot believe that he is a spy, you know.
And yet people are, aren't they?
And yet people are.
Third in command of the IRA was.
Oh yes. Oh yes, but it's difficult to see how they could have infiltrated this because we weren't a group. That's what I'm saying. Although people have alleged online that we were infiltrated, but they've got no evidence for it whatsoever. They're just like saying it. That's all.
I have taken your name, Jeff, don't worry. It does seem a lifetime away, doesn't it? I mean, I'm trying to think of what was happening in Shropshire 30-something years ago, and I remember, certainly in the hospital where I worked, we wouldn't serve Del Monte stuff, and it was quite a big debate. Talking to people and explaining why we wouldn't serve these wretched plums or pears or peaches, and discussing with the catering manager, and I remember there was quite a lot more stuff going on in the big cities, but I think we felt that was quite significant at the hospital, and the peaches are probably still the story. It was a great opportunity to talk to people about what was going on.
We've got the same debate going on now about Israel, about Zionism.
Yeah, and of course with the Chilean stuff, you know, that was
Later on, yes.
73, 74, so I think even in Shropshire there was stuff going on, but I think the big event, of course, was the release of Mandela, wasn't it?
Yes.
It was an explosion of solidarity, and also kind of think people kind of quickly learning about what had happened there for decades. You know, and I think that was kind of a big learning curve for younger, much younger people than me, I think.
Yes.
I think that's an important point actually, because, well, I mean, there's definitely a gargantuan effort by various forces to rewrite the history, trying to turn Mandela into Gandhi, and the fight against apartheid was some kind of moral crusade of good against evil, and good won. Isn't that good? You know, my kids are taught about it as if it was some faraway place long ago. There's anybody under the age of 40 sees it as history in a foreign land, and what's important about the opportunities of this and other likewise events is to demonstrate that actually, no, it's not history in a foreign land. This is real living politics, and it's carrying on today in just a different form. And it's the rewriting of history by mass popular culture. And then removing key sections out of history is it's real. It has real effects on people's psychology and mind and their frame of reference when they think about this. And it's just something for us to be aware of, that when you was living in it and part of it, and everyone here, I get the impression, was in some form or another, in a sense you think it's inconceivable no one else could see it the way it was. But when it's gone, and my two youngest are 22 and 17, you know, it's until, you know, they had some opportunity, you know, individually, it was, they learned about the Roman Empire, they learned about the Chinese Empire, they learned about, you know, the Second World War, and they learned about apartheid, all far away long ago. kind of things, and not really realising that it was the British Empire that was, amongst other empires, supporting it and creating it.
Yeah, I think it's important to realise that the apartheid system was a crime against humanity, and broadly speaking, the United States and its allies supported the apartheid regime in the Cold War, supported the apartheid regime, and the Soviet Union and its allies were supporting the ANC. That's the fact of the matter. But that's what they tried to hide for all sorts of reasons. That's what they tried to hide. That was it. And Britain benefited economically from this relationship with South Africa and from the apartheid system. All that cheap fruit and cheap South African goods, wine and sherry and other things coming into Britain were all artificially cheap because of the artificially cheap pay, wages and living standards of the South African people. And the banks, you know, and all the major British companies had investments in South Africa. They all had their subsidiaries, all the high street stores and so on, and the oil companies. You saw them when you went there, they were all there. And they were all practising racism and benefiting from their exploitation. They were supporting the regime. They say afterwards they weren't, but they were in practice. Britain was actually supporting the regime, although it was all saying, you know, we're against it, or they were against the worst aspects of it, you know, and kind of things. But they actually were supporting it, and they could have brought it down any day if they wanted to. If the City of London had decided to pull the plug on the apartheid regime, they could have done so any time, but they didn't, until they could see a way of doing it that suited their interests, and could see the game was up and so on. So that's important. That's what explains, what justifies what we did. We weren't just saying, oh, there's an injustice on the other side of the world, I care, I'm a moral person, I'd like to go and do something about it. It wasn't that. It was about Britain and its role in the world. That's the important thing, I think.
May I ask, since liberation from apartheid, how is the South African government developing a capitalist economy now in South Africa, or are they pushing for socialist policies, and how far the Western countries are, you know, either supporting or not?
Well, it's an interesting question, which I'm probably not qualified to answer, but South Africa is still a capitalist country. It's no longer an apartheid country, but it's a capitalist country still, and the ANC and the state are arenas of struggle between right and left. And that struggle is going on, and it manifests itself in various ways. And there's a lot of unfinished business since the defeat of apartheid, because the price for the relatively peaceful transition and the price for deciding not to punish lots and lots of people who have played a criminal role, morally criminal role in the regime, it's been paid for by a lot of poorest people who were entitled to expect rather more than they've got out of it. Now, many of them have got a great deal out of it, no question about it. I've seen some of the houses that they live in now. I mean, it's the only country in the world that gives people houses. You know, they build an estate full of houses with nice little solar heating on the roof of every house, and a kitchen and a little bit of garden around it and so on. And they say you come out of the shanty town and that's your house. You know, no one else anywhere in the world does that, I don't think. And they've done that to thousands of people. They brought electricity and sewage and clean water to people and education and so on. So a huge amount they've done, but huge a little bit better to be a migrant in a new shanty town in South Africa, a new established one, than to be in the poverty wherever you were elsewhere. So that goes on as well.
Hasn't that led to issues recently? Because it didn't.
Yes, it's been led to fighting. Yes, and xenophobic attacks on migrants. Yes, yes, which is the sort of thing you get in all sorts of places. Yeah, the huge difficulties there. I mean, you opened up a whole new subject, which is a very good one, but I'm not really in a position to answer it. But it is an ongoing question. And I say that the ANC itself and the state are arenas of struggle between different tendencies, and that's going on, and it's going to go on for quite a long time yet.
So from what you said there, Ken, it sounded like you didn't really agree with it. Was it Truth and Reconciliation? That took place afterwards.
You're not going to get him to say that.
The Truth and Reconciliation position. I'm not an expert on that, but obviously it involved a lot of people saying, well, what you did, if you'd committed a crime under the regime, you could come forward and say, yes, I killed all those people, I did it in the service of the government, of the regime, and I've told all of it, I've not held anything back, I've said everything I know, and I'm sorry. You see, and then the commission would say, they would question you about it, and the families of the people you killed would be there in the audience looking on, and then they say, they give you a certificate to say you were absolved, that you weren't going to be charged and weren't going to be punished for what you'd done because you'd come clean. That's the deal. Now the benefit of it is, you know, drawing a line and the past, relatively peaceful society and so on. And the cooperation of some of the white elite with the new regime. The price, who can say what the price of that is, you know? Yeah.
Very
Interesting episode, but whether it's a great idea, the different opinions on that.
History will perhaps tell.
So I'm not an expert on it, but yeah.
Just to follow on from what I said, I recently read an article which showed how people who had lived in slums and Soweto and so on were now developing their own businesses. And wasn't this great, you know, that they were, you know, building up a kind of capitalist society and doing well. Yeah.
Some of them are. But
Yeah.
they introduced a law called B, Black Economic Empowerment, which means that a company which brings a certain number of black people onto its board of directors or into senior positions gets favourable treatment for government contracts and so on. You see, and it could put, it's like having "We are an equal opportunities employer" on your logo or something, you know. And it's well argued, you know, that this has done very well for a few people, but for some, that it's corrupted a number of people. You get in there, you get an office, you're black, you get an office, and you're a kind of a what's the word, you know, like a decoration more than anything else. And you're brought in also for your links with the ANC and with the government ministers and officials. So it's many people regard it as a form of corruption, or that it's developed in that way as a form of corruption. But there's different opinions about it. I'm not the expert on that. People expect me to be an expert on all that stuff now, and I have to keep studying it. I keep going on the web and seeing what's happening and so on.
Yeah.
But I'm not an expert. It's an interesting subject.
Just out of interest, though, as well, I mean, was it really the English-speaking white minority in South Africa that supported the struggle? You know,
some English-speaking people like to make out that the Afrikaners were worse and we were not so bad.
Yeah, exactly.
There's always
really hard in issue.
There's always that stuff goes on, and other people say, oh, it's rubbish, you know, and so on.
Right.
I don't know. I'm not in a position to know that. I'm not sure you can categorise everybody that way anyway. Categorising people, they were big into that, of course, you know, everybody had to be categorised.
Yeah.
Just whether you were black, you know, if you were the borderline sort of thing, and which school could you go to, and which area could you live in. If they could stick a pencil in your hair and it stayed there, without when you took your fingers away, then you were black, you see? There's this sort of stuff, this sort of nonsense.
I mean, there are stories where, you know, daughters of the same parents, one was declared black, one was declared Indian. The same parents, and didn't just slightly like, oh well, that's it on this chart, off you go. And quite.
And if a family had a child who was a bit too dark, if a white family had a child who was a bit too dark, an embarrassment, they shut them away, keep them out of sight, because it could bring the whole family down and get them recategorised in the wrong race. And that was a tragedy for them. So they hide one way. Terrible.
Anybody else want to say
Just
anything?
Sean Hossey, was it, the father from Dublin that was...
Sean Hosey.
Hosey, yeah. Was the Irish government sort of campaigning to get him released? Was there a...
He says in there that the British ambassador refused to help him because he wasn't British. He had an Irish passport, he was born in Dublin, although he'd been living in London at the time, you know, when he went off. And the Irish ambassador or consul, whatever he was, came to visit him in prison and was very nice and very pleasant to him, but couldn't do a thing, or didn't do a thing for him. That's what he says.
Because I think the government's took the view that, well, you've broken a domestic law and you go to jail, and, you know, it's not unjust.
I say in his case he wasn't a British national, and neither was Alex, neither was Alex or Maurice José, you see. Yeah, but interesting, you know what they would have done, but none of the people that they actually caught were British nationals, actually.
I think I listened to Mary Chamberlain on Radio 4 programme just a couple of weeks ago,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
kind of thing, where the Radio 4 interviewer, they always have 3 people on, talk about their lives, that kind of stuff, but they had Mary Chamberlain on. And the Radio 4 interviewer said, so if any of you were caught, she was asking Mary, it was my dad, she was saying, who was worked in the British Embassy,
Oh.
and who would have had to. And so when you said Sean Hosey, and then you said the British ambassador, I immediately thought on the radio, I'd think, oh, her dad wouldn't do anything for Sean. But it was a different country, so that was his technical, because that kind of thing really matters, doesn't it, international law. But yeah, no, it was just interesting. It was, I read this book, which I recommend, if you haven't read it, you really have got to read. And when I got to Sean Hosey, where he makes reference to this escape from Pretoria, I think, in there. Certainly in some, I read it because I immediately put that book down and went and read the book Escape from Pretoria, because it's a prison escape by ANC activists from Pretoria. This has got to be awesome. And this is I mean, if we had a magic wand, I'd be making films and Hollywood blockbusters out of this. The stories in this book, if it was the CIA in the Cold War, we'd have all had 100 dam buster type movies rammed down our throats about it. And so I'm looking for the South African dam buster equivalent, escape from, Pretoria, or, the 10 years of hell, or what, 10 years of heaven, 10 years, anything, whatever. But it's, so it really deserves it. It's got all the meat in there, and absolutely everyone, as you would expect, really. But nevertheless, it's still remarkable to see absolutely everyone that sort of says, well, I did my little bit, and then that was it. And as you say, didn't really consider the dangers and all the rest of it. And then only with time and hindsight can you appreciate it yourself. And everybody else should appreciate it alongside with you. And so if anyone has any influence in colleges or schools, then this is the kind of material that can be taught in schools, in civics classes, this kind of thing. It's certainly an element for discussion. It's getting, it's getting no state support, but in as much as the issue ever intersects with the state, Liverpool City Council, it got cross-party support. The Tories, the Liberals and Labours supported the putting up of the plaque for the seafarers. There's Francis O'Grady, the TUC General Secretary, written a magnificent review of the book. It's had a meeting in Parliament, hasn't it?
Yes, it was launched at the House of Commons in a room, in a committee room, booked by
Peter Hain.
Peter Hain, yes, he's been quite supportive, very supportive.
Very supportive, Peter Hain, and that video of that 2012 launch is on the website along with most other things, along with this video later on. There's and so from a point of view of making organisations aware of this issue doesn't necessarily meet with the hostility that you could imagine it would have met 30 years ago. It's not got any formal hostility behind it. So in that sense, if there's anywhere, Liverpool has obviously a connection with the seafarers, and that's where that comes from. And London is obviously, lots of connections around London. But as you say, the American
Danny
Schechter, who died just a little while ago, that had an American focus. And that gave us some publicity in America, because obviously only the Americans important. And then Sean Hosey could no doubt in Ireland, we could use that. But I'm not sure what other hooks there are in terms of the 40-odd writers to get recognition of other elements in society. And I'll just make you aware of it, it's perfect for historians. Original source material. None of this stuff existed. If you was any kind of historian writing about any kind of the struggle, anything in the latter half of the 20th century relating to South Africa, relating to apartheid, then you've got a reservoir of primary sources here, haven't you?
Yes, that's right.
which most historians haven't got. And so, you know,
That's why I asked them to write their story instead of me giving an account of what they told me. I knew that if they each wrote their own story, no one could deny at least that was their own story. Even if there was something made of mistakes of detail in there, they're talking about their own perception, and that's part of the history.
I suppose the thing that strikes me as well, as sitting here talking and thinking about, is the impact on the other parts of South Africa as well. Countries like Angola, Zimbabwe, Rhodesia previously, Mozambique, because bringing down the apartheid regime must have had a massive impact on those countries as well, mustn't it?
Well, yes, but they were stages towards them. The line of liberation was moving south towards them. But a great deal of that is told in Ronnie's book, Armed and Dangerous. These are what they call the frontline states, you know. And he was living at times in some of those countries, and yes, that was all part of the story. The whole thing of the fall of the Portuguese Empire, of course, with the anti-fascist revolution there, made a huge change. And then, of course, the role of the Cubans. There's very moving things in Ronnie's book. One of the things that make, I mean, it shouldn't be sort of more emotional about the white people than about the black people. And sometimes it tells how they had this information centre set up in London, often staffed by Ronnie's wife, actually, Eleanor, and a phone recorded, a place where they could leave a recorded message on the phone. And as the South African Army was moving forward to invade Angola, members of that army, that white army, were phoning into this centre in London, leaving messages saying, "My unit's moving forward tomorrow." You know, they were warning their enemy that they were coming to help the Angola, the MPLA.
South African back, wasn't it?
Yes, they were coming. I mean, most amazing stuff. You know.
Yeah. And who was it in Mozambique that had a woman, wasn't it? Was injured in an explosion or killed in an explosion?
Ruth First.
Ruth
First was indeed murdered them. I was in a car driven by this man, Paolo Jordan, who's written a foreword to the book, and he said to me, I'm a bit deaf in this ear, because that was the ear that I had towards Ruth when she was blown up. He was in the office with her, and he just got a deaf ear and a few injuries, but she was, of course, killed by this passerborn, Judge Lobo's wife.
Yeah,
was killed by this passerborn. Yes, that was one of the ways they kill people. They assassinate people, send them a passerborn or a letter bomb, and whoever opened it would get this explosion. Yeah, that's right. They killed Ruth First. That was how effective, that was how important she was to them as an enemy. Yes.
Just on the issue of where you were saying earlier, where you were saying about no apparent infiltration, and then you're thinking, well, if Ronnie's safe, as it were, Ronnie knows the individuals, and that's as far as that can go, or the district secretary of the Young Communist League in this case, and then there's but one presumes that none of the 50 people were spies. One of them could have been, but then what would they have said? Some bloke who running Casseroles is organising me to go over to South Africa. The spy agency is going to say, well, carry on and go and let us know what happens. And what can you tell them? Ronnie Casseroles sent me. Well, they already knew that. So in that sense, fine, okay, so one of the 50 could have been a spy, and sort of where does that take them? But there's no reason to believe any of the 50 were. But the only other secondary element was, and it's covered in the book, that wasn't in the job description.
Oh, this is Bob Allen, when he took over the job of London District Secretary of the Young Communist League, after George Bridges was too old to be a member. And he said, yes, that when he got the job, he settled in, that he found this new job that he was given in addition. He said it wasn't in my job description. I was supposed to recruit people to go to South Africa. You know, he couldn't go because he was too well known. So he's not sending people to do something he had done himself. He had to select people and then hand them over to Ronnie and then wish they came back safely, you know, which is quite it's quite an amazing thing to do, and keep it secret from anybody. So
that was the Achilles heel. If the London District Secretary of the Young Communist League was an agent of the state,
well, yes,
then everyone's finished. Then they've got the lot, because that was the primary thing. But unless they got that person, you don't get, there is no group to get.
I was just going to ask about, can you explain what happened about Winnie Mandela? Because I did remember there was a tremendous support when I was young for Winnie Mandela.
It's worth reading her life
and then there
story.
was this tremendous bust up, and then she was accused of all sorts of atrocities and so on. And I that really hit me quite hard at the time.
Well, I'm not in a position to speak very much about it, but I read her life story. You know, they just gave her a very, very awful life, and it's no surprise that she turned out a very, very angry woman. Who wouldn't? The way they treated her.
Yeah.
You know, and at one point the police came along and said, we're moving you out of here and into another place, long, you and your children, and to a place a long way away where there's very few people, and a little town where you're not known, and that's where you're going to live. And they piled her stuff onto a lorry, and her children took her off. When she got there, this house that they were giving her to live in was full of rubbish, piled high with rubble, and they had to clear it out themselves first. You know, and then when she lived there forever after, there was police always parked opposite the house, and any time they come in the night or any time we're checking to see if you've got a meeting going on in here, and they were just trying to harass her, and they made life for her and for her children just as bad as they could. You know, yeah, and she turned out very, very angry, and who wouldn't, you know.
Yeah.
And this is partly because of this suffering. She's still very popular in South Africa.
Is she?
Oh yeah, she's still a leading member of the ANC. She's on the leading
Yeah.
committee. I think she's she's leader of the National Women's Organisation, I think, or something like that. And because she suffered so much, and people accepted, and she did so much. But of course, there's, if you want to see something about it, you can see the film Mandela Long Walk to Freedom, which is like a story of the couple in a way. It's too much of a personal thing to my mind. It didn't really enlighten you on the politics, but it's about this relationship partly, you know. And you know, she had a terrible time, terrible time.